Greetings, dear viewer, and welcome to Purposes Crossed, where I hope that people who are called by Jesus for different purposes cross paths and exchange ideas. In this video, we continue with our series of devotions on the Psalms, and today we will deal with Psalm 28. Psalm 28 is a short psalm attributed to David. The psalm reflects much of our lives, a mixture of praise and petition, confidence and confusion. The psalm begins with a cry to Yahweh, whom David calls his protector. David asks Yahweh not to ignore him or to overlook him. Immediately, David entertains the idea of what would happen if Yahweh were to ignore him. David paints a stark picture, in effect saying that he would die if Yahweh were to ignore him. David's complete dependence on God is clear, and David expects an intimate, ongoing relationship with Yahweh. Death is the result, according to David, if Yahweh would turn his face from him. Do we have such a high view of God's involvement in our lives? Can we truly entertain the idea that we would die were it not for God's continued favor towards us? Are we so thoroughly immersed in God's love that we cannot even imagine an existence, let alone a life, without his being favorably disposed towards us? David ascribes his confidence in God's favor to God's desire for justice. This is an important element to keep in mind. Yahweh has made a covenant with his people, and the covenant allows Yahweh's people to expect him to be favorably disposed towards them. But it is justice, not some blind, unthinking favoritism. Yahweh does not act on behalf of those who themselves act unjustly. He does not look with favor on those who lie to others and plot against others. Rather, since he expects his people to be like him, showing mercy and justice to all, he is inclined to deal favorably with his people. David insists that those who act unjustly do so because they do not understand the justice of Yahweh. More to the point, they do not understand that justice is an expression of Yahweh's character. It is not some element that has any existence outside of the person of Yahweh, but is intrinsic to him. This world and its inhabitants, including God's non-human creatures, cry out for justice in the face of injustice, because Yahweh himself has infused his good creation with the ability to be fruitful only when his human creatures exercise their God-given authority to spread his justice in creation. In the middle of the psalm, David says, Yahweh deserves praise, for he has heard my plea for mercy. We often do not receive the response to our pleas so quickly. Many of us have had to wait years and even decades for God to answer. Some of us may still be waiting with our hands open for our prayers to be answered. Does this mean that David had a special prayer life because of which God answered his every prayer? Or is it the case that David had an unshakable trust in God, which led him to believe that God had heard his prayers? The Psalms have many laments which clearly indicate that God does not always answer the prayers of his people. This honesty is unfortunately lacking in many Christian circles. We hear people say that God always answers prayers, that his answer is either yes or no, or not now, or not this. We hear people say that God always answers prayer, but that we may not like his answer. But one main point of prayer is not just to align our will with God's, but also to attempt to align God's will to ours. That is the nature of any genuine relationship. Genuine, healthy relationships involve negotiations and compromise. And if the compromise is always from one side, that is not a healthy relationship, but an abusive one. Hence, statements like the ones above may contain some truth, but they cannot be the whole truth. David declares that God has not just heard his prayer and given some answer, but has answered his prayer in the way he expected. Here, of course, it is a prayer for mercy from the schemes of wicked people who are out to get him. Can we have that confidence that God answers every such prayer? Of course, we know of many Christians who were persecuted to the point of death. Surely some of them cried for deliverance, but their prayers were not answered. It is disingenuous to say that denied deliverance is an answer to prayer. After all, if any response is considered an answer to prayer, then prayer is rendered meaningless. Ironically, in order for prayer to be meaningful, we must accept that some prayers are just not answered. They fall on the deaf ears of heaven and make us wonder what the point of prayer really is. Saying that unanswered prayer is actually answered prayer is a denial of the reality that we face. And attempting to explain with certainty why a prayer was not answered empties prayer of its mysterious and unexplainable nature in a vain attempt to provide some sort of confidence in prayer. It is clear, however, from the last verse of Psalm 28 that David's prayers have not been answered. Even though he declares confidence that God strengthens, protects, and rescues him and his people, at the end of the psalm, he is still waiting for God to deliver and empower his people. What we realize then is that David's statements of confidence and his declaration of praise are made not because God has answered his prayer, but in the face of the fact that God had still not answered his prayers. Psalm 28 does not give us the assurance that God will answer our prayers, as we might conclude from a naive reading of the psalm. Rather, Psalm 28 gives us an example of how to approach the issue of unanswered prayer. We recognize with David that only God can provide us the deliverance we desire. What this means is that we acknowledge that we are still in the situation because God has not delivered us. But we refuse, like David refused, to use that fact that God has not answered our prayer as a reason to turn our back on Him. Just as Satan asked God, "Does Job serve God for nothing?" so also unanswered prayer raises the same question about us. Do we serve God for nothing? It is very easy to express and display trust when prayers are readily answered. But what about when they are not?